welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be taking a look at some interesting stuff surrounding Shen Yun Performing Arts.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of them.
Yeah, they're pretty popular,
Mm-hmm.
known for these really visually impressive performances celebrating traditional Chinese culture. We're going to be looking at this investigative report that came out from the Epoch Times
Okay.
that takes a close look at a series of articles that were published by the New York Times about Shen Yun.
Interesting. So it's like a meta-analysis almost.
Kind of, yeah. It's
Yeah.
just looking at how the reporting was done and some of the claims that are being made
Got it.
by both sides. So, for our listeners who might not be as familiar with Shen Yun, could you give us a little bit of background on the company?
Yeah, so Shen Yun has been around since like 2006, I think. And they're really popular. They've got like 8 different groups touring the world. They sell out these huge theaters.
I've heard, yeah.
Millions of people have seen them. But what's really interesting about them is that they were founded by Chinese expatriates who practice Falun Gong.
Falun Gong, okay.
Yeah, it's a spiritual practice that emphasizes like meditation, mindfulness, moral values, that kind of thing. And this is actually really key to understanding what's going on here because Falun Gong has faced some serious persecution in China since the late 1990s.
Okay, so that's a pretty significant detail.
Definitely.
And it ties into some of the allegations that were made by the New York Times in those articles that they published. So they published a series of articles, 5 in total, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And their main article was a pretty extensive deep dive of its own. It was over 5,000 words. And in it, they were alleging that there was artist abuse happening within Shen Yun.
Artist abuse? Like, what do you mean?
So they were claiming that dancers were being pressured to perform while they were injured and that they were discouraged from seeking proper medical treatment.
Wow, that's pretty serious.
Yeah, and that's where the Epoch Times and subsequently the Philadelphia Information Center, also known as the FDIC, they kind of entered the picture. They claimed that the New York Times wasn't necessarily presenting the full picture.
Okay, so we've got some conflicting narratives here.
Exactly. And it's important to keep in mind that the FDIC, they closely monitor the persecution of Falun Gong globally. So they've been tracking attempts to discredit the practice for years, which gives them a unique perspective, but it also leads to questions of potential bias in their approach.
Right, of course.
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, what's interesting is that the FDIC, they conducted their own investigation. They interviewed current and former Shen Yun artists. They spoke to medical professionals.
Okay.
And what they found directly contradicted the New York Times' claims.
So they're saying there's no evidence of a hoax?
Well, they're saying they found no evidence to support those allegations that dancers were being discouraged or prevented from receiving medical treatment for injuries.
Interesting.
They even presented statements from doctors who practice near Shen Yun's headquarters in New York, stating that they treat Shen Yun performers regularly.
Oh, okay, so there's a paper trail there.
Right. But the New York Times, they didn't interview any of these medical professionals, which the FDIC points to as a potential oversight in their reporting.
So both sides are pointing fingers a little bit.
Yeah, and this is where I think the story starts to get really fascinating.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So the New York Times admitted that the initial idea for their article came from an informant, someone claiming to have insider knowledge of Shen Yun.
An informant. Okay, so it's starting to sound a little bit more like a spy thriller.
Right. And the FDIC, they allege that this informant, coupled with potential pre-existing biases on the part of the journalists, shaped the narrative of the articles.
So they're suggesting that maybe the journalists had an agenda going in?
Well, they're not explicitly saying that, but they're implying that perhaps there was already a certain perspective in place before they even started doing the investigation.
I see.
And what's more is that former Shen Yun performers who have positive experiences with the company have come forward and said that they were never even contacted by the New York Times for the article.
Huh, so it seems like we're seeing 2 very different versions of reality here.
Exactly. On the one hand, you have the New York Times highlighting these potentially concerning practices based on the accounts that they gathered. And on the other hand, you have the FDIC claiming that those accounts aren't representative of the full story and that there's a deliberate attempt to paint Shen Yun in a negative light.
Wow, it's a real he said, she said situation.
It is. And to make matters even more complicated, this all ties back into the FDIC's ongoing investigation into the CCP's attempts to discredit Falun Gong.
Oh, wow, so this goes even deeper.
It does. The FDIC, they argue that the narrative presented by the New York Times aligns with a broader campaign by the CCP to suppress the practice of Falun Gong, and by extension, silence Shen Yun, which they view as a platform for Falun Gong practitioners.
So they're saying that Shen Yun is caught in the crosshairs of a much larger geopolitical battle.
That's exactly what they're suggesting. It's a really complex situation with a lot of layers to unpack.
Definitely sounds like it. And we're just getting started. And it's not just about silencing Shen Yun. They're saying it's about discrediting Falun Gong on a global scale,
So like a smear campaign.
Exactly. Painting it as dangerous, extreme, trying to justify the persecution that's happening within China.
Wow, that's a pretty serious accusation to say that a major media outlet is playing a part in something like that.
Right. But the FDIC, they're not just throwing out accusations. They've actually documented over 120 attempts to sabotage Shen Yun.
120? What, like actual attempts?
Yeah, ranging from trying to disrupt performances to spreading misinformation online. They even say there was a bomb threat once at a theater where Shen Yun was scheduled to perform.
Are you serious? That's insane.
Yeah, and they believe that these New York Times articles might be part of a more sophisticated strategy, using influential media outlets to shape public opinion on a larger scale.
So it's like a propaganda war playing out in the pages of the New York Times.
That's essentially what they're suggesting. And they point to a few specific things in the articles to support their claim. Like, for example, remember how the New York Times included that quote from the former dancer who emailed them?
Yeah, the one who talked about feeling pressured to perform.
Yeah. Right. Well, it turns out in that same email, she also expressed some serious concerns about the way the New York Times was conducting their reporting.
No way. So she was critical of them in the same email where she was sharing her experiences.
Exactly. She actually praised Shen Yun in the email and said that she felt like the journalists already had a predetermined narrative going in, but those parts of her email were completely omitted from the published article.
Wow. So they left out the part where she defended Shen Yun and questioned their objectivity.
Exactly. And to me, that raises some serious red flags. It makes you wonder what else might have been left on the cutting room floor, so to speak.
Right. Like how much of the story are we not seeing?
And that ties into this whole idea of selective reporting, choosing information that fits a certain narrative while ignoring anything that contradicts it. The FDIC argues that this happened throughout the New York Times investigation, further fueling their suspicion of bias.
So it's not just about whether the allegations against Shen Yun are true or not. It's also about how those allegations were gathered, presented, and potentially influenced by external factors.
Precisely. It adds a whole other layer of complexity to the situation.
It does. And speaking of external factors, the FDIC's investigation uncovered another really interesting detail. They found connections between some of the former Shen Yun dancers interviewed by the New York Times and the Beijing Dance Academy. The Beijing Dance Academy, isn't that one of the most prestigious dance schools in China?
It is. And it has direct ties to the CCP. In fact, a lot of its funding comes directly from the Chinese government.
So you're saying there's a potential link between the New York Times' sources and an institution that might have its own reasons for wanting to see Shen Yun discredited?
It's certainly possible, and it gets even more interesting. One of the dancers who's featured prominently in the New York Times articles actually runs a dance studio in Taiwan.
Okay.
And according to reports, her studio asked families who practice Falun Gong to leave. Yeah. Suggesting a potential shift in allegiance. It's like all of a sudden she's gone from being critical of Shen Yun to aligning herself with an institution that has close ties to the CCP.
This whole thing just keeps getting more and more complicated. It's like every time you think you're getting closer to the truth, another layer is revealed.
And that's the thing about these kinds of situations. It's not always clear-cut. There are so many moving pieces, so many different perspectives. It's hard to know what to believe.
Right. It really makes you think twice about everything you read.
It does. And it highlights the importance of media literacy, being able to critically analyze information, especially in today's world where there's so much of it coming at us from all directions.
Absolutely. Because it's not just about what happened with Shen Yun and the New York Times. It's about how easy it is for narratives to be manipulated and how important it is to be aware of those manipulations.
Exactly. And on that note, the FDIC doesn't stop at just pointing out potential bias in the New York Times reporting. They go a step further and accuse the newspaper of actually repeating what they call CCP propaganda tropes.
CCP propaganda tropes? Like, what do you mean?
Well, for example, they take issue with the way the New York Times characterized the motivations of Shen Yun artists. The articles describe them as being driven by an impending apocalypse.
An impending apocalypse.
Yeah, painting this picture of extremism and fear-mongering. But the FDIC argues that this portrayal is completely inaccurate and misleading. They say that when they interviewed current and former members of Shen Yun, none of them described their beliefs in that way.
So it's a question of framing, taking someone's words and twisting them to fit a certain narrative.
Exactly. And the FDIC argues that this kind of framing, whether intentional or not, can be incredibly damaging, especially for a group like Falun Gong that already faces so much persecution and scrutiny.
It's kind of scary when you think about it. You know how easily a narrative can be manipulated and the impact that can have on people's lives?
No, yeah, absolutely. And this whole thing about their beliefs being framed as extreme, it's a classic tactic to discredit groups and movements throughout history. You paint them as radical or dangerous, and suddenly any legitimate concerns they have get dismissed.
Right, it's like you're automatically discredited if people think you're some kind of extremist.
Which, speaking of potentially extreme or at least questionable practices, we didn't even get to fully unpack that New York Times is reporting on the Fei Tian Academy. Remember, that's the school that's affiliated with Shen Yun.
Oh, yeah. They were talking about how strict it was there.
Yeah, like requiring permission to leave campus and limiting internet access and stuff. The New York Times was painting it as this really oppressive environment.
Right, right. I remember that.
Yeah.
And it did seem pretty strict, I have to admit. But the FDIC countered that by saying those kinds of policies are actually pretty common in a lot of elite performing arts schools.
Really? I didn't realize. Yeah, they were comparing it to like prestigious ballet academies or music conservatories where students have these really rigorous training schedules and a lot of restrictions on their time and freedom.
Huh. So it's like all about the context, I guess. What one person might see as oppressive, another person might view as normal or even necessary for a certain type of training.
Exactly. And the FDIC's point was that the New York Times didn't really provide that context. They just presented these policies in a vacuum, which made them seem a lot more extreme than they might actually be in reality.
Gotcha. So it's like they were cherry-picking details to fit a certain narrative.
Right. And to be fair, the FDIC does acknowledge that life at Fei Tian is demanding, but they also emphasize that it's a supportive environment where students are given incredible opportunities. Like they offer these generous scholarships
Right.
that cover tuition, room, and board, even travel expenses for many students.
Wow. So it's not like these kids are being forced into anything.
Right, exactly. It's a choice they're making. And the FDIC argues that their choice is often driven by a passion for their art and a desire to be part of something bigger than themselves.
Which, I mean, when you put it that way, it makes sense that they'd be willing to make certain sacrifices, right? Like if you're truly dedicated to something, you're going to put in the work and the time and the effort.
Exactly. And it's not like they're completely cut off from the world either. They still have access to phones and communication and all that. But there's a focus on discipline and dedication that's essential for that level of artistic excellence.
That makes sense. So basically, the FDIC is saying that the New York Times took these details about Fei Tian's policies and presented them in a way that was misleading and out of context.
Right. They're saying that it was part of a larger pattern of biased reporting that ultimately served to reinforce a negative narrative about Shen Yun and Falun Gong.
Which is a pretty serious accusation to make against a major media outlet.
It is. And the FDIC isn't letting them off the hook either. They're calling for the New York Times to retract the articles, conduct a full internal investigation into their reporting practices, and implement safeguards to prevent similar issues from happening in the future.
Wow. So they're not just asking for a correction, they're asking for a major overhaul of how the New York Times hand out these kinds of sensitive topics.
Exactly. And it really highlights the high stakes of this whole debate. It's not just about one band's company or a series of articles. It's about the power of media narratives and how they can impact people's lives and reputations and even potentially put them in danger.
It's true. And it makes you realize how important it is to be critical consumers of information, to question what we read and see and hear, and to seek out multiple perspectives before forming our own opinions.
Absolutely, because in this day and age with the internet and social media and everything, it's so easy to get caught up in these echo chambers where we're only exposed to information that confirms our existing biases.
Exactly. So it's on us to be more discerning, to do our own research, to think for ourselves, and to remember that there are always multiple sides to every story.
Well said. I think that's a good note to end on.
Mm.
This deep dive has been a wild ride full of twists and turns, and I'm sure our listeners have a lot to think about after hearing all of this.
Definitely. We've only just scratched the surface here, but hopefully it sparked some curiosity and encouraged everyone to do their own digging and come to their own conclusions.
Exactly, because that's what it's all about. Engaging with these complex issues, asking tough questions, and never taking anything at face value.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Shen Yun controversy. We'll see you next time.